In January 1857, in Kentucky's Copperhead Hollow, 3 feral triplet brothers, each over 7 feet tall, lured traveling women into underground caves. Raised in isolation, they believed they were biblical giants destined to restore an ancient bloodline through a twisted breeding program. How did these crimes remain hidden for years? What religious delusion convinced them their actions were righteous? And how many women vanished before anyone suspected the truth? Before we uncover this dark history, subscribe to preserve these forgotten stories and comment with your city and local time. Let's ensure these victims are never forgotten. In the spring of 1827, a woman appeared in the mountains of eastern Kentucky carrying 3 infants wrapped in threadbare blankets. She arrived on foot, walking the narrow trail that wound through Breathitt County toward a place that would become known as Copperhead Hollow. Local families who saw her pass remembered a thin, severe woman in her late 20s with dark hair pulled tight against her skull and eyes that seemed to look through people rather than at them. She identified herself as Delilah Ballard, widow of a traveling preacher named Jacob Ballard, who she claimed had died of fever somewhere in Tennessee. She spoke little beyond what necessity required, accepted no offers of assistance or shelter, and made clear through her manner that she desired no friendship, no community, and no interference in her affairs. The hollow she chose lay 13 miles from the county seat of Jackson, accessible only by a footpath too narrow and rough for wagons. It sat in a natural bowl formed by limestone cliffs that rose nearly vertical on 3 sides, creating a depression in the mountains where fog gathered thick as wool and lingered long past sunrise. The single approach followed a creek that ran swift and cold even in summer, cutting through rock worn smooth by centuries of water. In winter, snow blocked the path entirely for weeks at a time, and even experienced hunters avoided the area because the terrain offered more danger than the game was worth. It was a place that seemed to exist outside the normal flow of human activity. Neither fully wilderness nor quite settled land, forgotten by time and avoided by instinct. Delilah built a cabin from logs she felled herself. Working through the summer and fall of 1827 with a determination that struck the few trappers who glimpsed her as something close to obsession. The structure she raised was crude but substantial, larger than a woman alone with 3 infants would seem to need, with a stone foundation sunk deep into the hillside and a root cellar that extended back into the limestone beneath. She planted no crops that anyone observed, kept no livestock that could be heard from the trail, and made no trips to Jackson for supplies beyond a single visit each autumn, when she would appear without warning to purchase salt, flour, and lamp oil with coins she produced from a leather pouch. The merchants who served her noted that she always bought 3 times the quantity a single woman would require, and that she never explained what she did with it in that isolated hollow where no one else was known to live. The years passed, and Delilah Ballard became a figure of local legend rather than concern. Mountain families were accustomed to those who sought isolation for reasons ranging from religious conviction to simple misanthropy, and a widow who wished to raise her sons away from civilization drew more curiosity than alarm. Circuit preachers who attempted to visit her in those early years reported being turned away before they could approach the cabin, with Delilah standing in the path and declaring that her family answered to God alone and required no earthly church. She refused all offers to send her sons to the community school that operated 3 months each year in Jackson, stating that she would provide their education herself from the Scriptures. When missionaries persisted, suggesting that children required contact with others their age, she responded that her boys were not like other children and would be corrupted by association with the world beyond the hollow. By 1835, when the triplets would have been 9 years old, no one in Breathitt County had seen them clearly enough to describe their faces. Hunters occasionally glimpsed movement in the trees near Copperhead Hollow, shapes too large to be deer but too quick to identify with certainty. Thomas Spencer, who operated a small farm 5 miles distant, reported seeing 3 tall figures moving single file along a ridge at twilight. But the distance and failing light made details impossible to determine. Mary Ann Spencer, his wife, noted in her household diary that she had heard what sounded like children's voices echoing through the hollow one autumn morning, but the sounds were strange, more like animals mimicking human speech than actual words. The community's understanding of Delilah's sons existed primarily through absence, through the awareness that 3 boys were growing to manhood in complete isolation from human society, learning only what their mother chose to teach them. The triplets emerged from their isolation in the early 1850s as figures that seemed to belong more to folklore than reality. Hunters and trappers who encountered them on mountain paths described 3 giants who moved through the forest with an unsettling, fluid grace, their footsteps nearly silent despite their enormous size. Each brother stood well over 7 feet tall, with frames built heavy from years of physical labor in the mountains. They wore homespun clothing that hung awkwardly on their oversized bodies, and their hair grew long and unkempt, falling past their shoulders in the style of no civilized man of that era. When approached, they would not meet the eyes of those who spoke to them, instead keeping their gazes fixed on the ground or middle distance, communicating through grunts and gestures rather than proper speech. The first documented encounter occurred in October 1851, when a merchant traveling from Jackson to settlements in Perry County came upon all 3 brothers standing motionless beside the trail near Copperhead Hollow. He later reported to Sheriff Nathaniel Combs that the men had simply watched him pass, turning their heads in unison to follow his movement, like predators tracking prey, but making no attempt to approach or speak. The merchant noted their extraordinary size and their strange manner of standing so close together that their shoulders nearly touched, as though they could not bear physical separation even for a moment. When he called out a greeting, the only response was a low sound from one of the brothers that might have been an attempt at speech or might have been something more primitive. Women traveling the mountain paths began reporting an increasing sense of being watched, of movement glimpsed in peripheral vision that vanished when they turned to look directly. Martha Hensley, who made regular trips between her family's farm and the settlement at Jackson, told her husband in the summer of 1852 that she felt eyes upon her whenever she passed near the hollow, and that she had twice seen enormous figures standing motionless among the trees at distances too great to discern features, but close enough to feel the weight of their attention. Other women reported similar experiences, describing a particular quality to the observation that felt different from the normal wariness of encountering strangers in isolated places. There was patience in it, they said, and calculation, as though whoever watched was studying them with purpose beyond mere curiosity. The first disappearances occurred in circumstances that seemed to confirm the mountain's reputation for claiming lives through natural causes rather than human malice. In September 1848, a widow named Elizabeth Halcombe vanished while traveling from Owsley County to family in Virginia. Search parties found no trace of her along the expected route, and the assumption settled that she had fallen from one of the narrow paths that wound along cliff faces, her body carried away by the swift creek waters or hidden in some crevasse too deep for searchers to access. 2 years later, in August 1850, a midwife named Catherine Stidham disappeared after attending a birth in a settlement near the Perry County border. She had been expected to arrive at her next destination within 2 days, but never appeared. Extensive searches yielded nothing, and the community eventually concluded that she too had fallen victim to the treacherous terrain. By 1852, a pattern existed that no one had yet recognized as such. Women traveling alone or with elderly companions were vanishing on paths that passed within a few miles of Copperhead Hollow. The disappearances were spaced far enough apart in time that each seemed an isolated tragedy rather than part of a series. The victims came from different communities and traveled for different purposes, sharing only their gender and their roots through that particular section of the mountains. When Rebecca Morrison and her daughter Hannah vanished in November 1852, along with Rebecca's elderly father, searchers found the old man's body at the base of a cliff, but no sign of the women. The discovery seemed to confirm that the family had met with an accident, perhaps attempting to help the father after a fall, and tumbling to their own deaths in places where the creek had carried them beyond recovery. The pattern began to reveal itself in the autumn of 1856 when veteran mountain men who had lived in Breathitt County for decades started comparing notes about the disappearances. Josiah Fletcher, a hunting guide and tracker of mixed Cherokee and Scots-Irish ancestry, mentioned to Sheriff Nathaniel Combs during a chance meeting in Jackson that he found it peculiar how only women seemed to vanish on the eastern mountain paths. Men traveling the same routes arrived at their destinations without incident. Elderly travelers who journeyed alone or in groups of other elderly people completed their trips safely. But women of childbearing age, whether traveling alone or accompanied by those too old or infirm to offer real protection, seemed to disappear with troubling regularity. Fletcher had been keeping an informal count in his mind, the way a man who lived close to the land noticed patterns in game movement or weather. By his reckoning, at least 6 women had vanished in the past 8 years on paths that all passed within a day's walk of Copperhead Hollow. Sheriff Combs was a methodical man who had learned during his years as a military scout that assumptions killed more men than bullets. He began reviewing missing person reports that had been filed with his office since he took the position in 1850, pulling documents from the wooden filing cabinet where such records accumulated like sediment. What he found troubled him deeply. Fletcher's count was conservative. When Combs included cases that predated his term as sheriff, cases he had to reconstruct from conversations with his predecessor and from county records. The number rose to at least 9 women vanished, and possibly as many as 12 if he counted cases where families had searched privately without filing official reports. Every single disappearance occurred between late spring and early autumn, when mountain travel was possible. Every single victim had been a woman between the ages of 18 and 40. And every single disappearance happened on or near trails that passed through the territory surrounding Copperhead Hollow. The discovery that broke the case open came in October 1856, when a farmer named William Bates found a woman's shoe on the trail approximately 2 miles from the hollow. The shoe was made of sturdy leather, well constructed and relatively new, not the sort of item a traveler would discard willingly. What made the find significant was how the shoe had been removed from its owner's foot. The leather had been cut cleanly through the laces and along the side, sliced open as though someone had needed to remove it quickly from a foot that was struggling or pulling away. Bates brought the shoe to Sheriff Combs, who recognized it as evidence of violence rather than accident. A woman who fell from a cliff would still be wearing her shoes when her body was found. A woman who removed her shoes to rest would unlace them normally. But a shoe that had been cut away suggested restraint, suggested someone holding a struggling victim and removing obstacles to captivity. Combs began asking questions throughout the county, seeking any information about strangers seen on the mountain paths, any unusual activity near Copperhead Hollow, any detail that might explain how women were vanishing without witnesses or physical evidence. What he learned pointed consistently toward the Ballard brothers. Multiple travelers reported encountering the three giants on trails near the hollow, always moving together, always watching passers-by with unsettling intensity. Thomas Spencer recalled that he had once seen the brothers speaking with a woman on the trail in the summer of 1854, offering what appeared to be directions or assistance, the woman nodding and gesturing as though asking about routes. Spencer had thought nothing of it at the time, beyond noting the oddness of seeing the reclusive brothers engaged in normal human interaction. But now the memory took on sinister dimension. The woman's description matched that of a traveler who had vanished 2 days later. By November 1856, Sheriff Combs had convinced himself that the Ballard brothers were responsible for at least some of the disappearances, but he had no proof that would justify action. He could not arrest men based on their presence near locations where women later vanished. He had no bodies, no witnesses to actual crimes, no physical evidence beyond a cut shoe that could not be definitively linked to any specific victim. What he needed was either a witness who had seen the brothers commit violence or a victim who had survived to testify. Without such evidence, any attempt to investigate the Ballards directly would fail in court and might alert them to flee deeper into the wilderness where they could never be found. The evidence Sheriff Combs needed arrived not through investigation, but through providence on a frozen January night in 1857. Reverend Micah Tolliver had been riding his circuit through the eastern Kentucky mountains for 12 years, traveling a route that covered over 150 miles and required him to stay wherever shelter could be found when darkness or weather made travel impossible. He was an unmarried man of 36 years, lean and hardened by constant travel, who knew the mountain paths as well as any man living, and understood that survival in winter required flexibility about where one spent the night. On January 14th, he was traveling from a settlement in Perry County toward Jackson when a blizzard descended with the sudden violence that characterized mountain weather. Within an hour, the trail became invisible under driving snow, and Tolliver recognized that continuing meant freezing to death before reaching any known shelter. He remembered hearing of a family living in Copperhead Hollow, the strange widow woman and her grown sons who kept to themselves, but who surely would not turn away a preacher seeking emergency shelter during a killing storm. Tolliver left the main trail and followed the creek toward the hollow, moving carefully through snow that already stood ankle-deep and showed no sign of stopping. He arrived at the Ballard cabin near dusk, his clothing stiff with ice and his hands numb despite heavy gloves. When he called out identifying himself as a circuit preacher seeking shelter from the storm, the door opened to reveal a tall, severe woman in her late 50s whose face showed no warmth, but who stepped aside to allow him entry with a gesture that suggested hospitality was a duty rather than a choice. The interior of the cabin struck Tolliver as profoundly wrong in ways he struggled to articulate even in later testimony. The furniture was built to a scale that made him feel like a child, chairs and a table constructed for people far larger than normal human proportions. The walls were covered with religious texts written in careful script, Bible verses copied out and pinned to every available surface, creating a collage of scripture that seemed less devotional than obsessive. 3 enormous men sat near the fire, each so tall that even seated, they towered over Tolliver's standing height. They watched him with expressions he could not read, their eyes moving over him with an intensity that reminded him of the way animals in cages watched their keepers. Delilah introduced them as her sons, Ezra, Amos, and Silas. But the brothers did not speak or acknowledge the introduction beyond slight movements of their heads. The meal Delilah served was simple venison and cornbread, and the conversation consisted entirely of Tolliver's attempts to make polite talk met with Delilah's brief responses, and the brothers' complete silence. She asked if he was traveling alone, how long he planned to stay in the region, whether anyone knew his route. The question seemed normal enough for someone concerned about a guest's safety, but something in how she asked them, in the particular weight she gave to whether anyone knew where he was, made Tolliver's instincts scream warnings he could not yet justify. After the meal, Delilah showed him to a corner of the main room where he could spread his bedroll. Explaining that the brothers would leave before dawn to check their trap lines and would not disturb him. Tolliver lay in the darkness, listening to the wind howl around the cabin, and the brothers moving about with surprising quietness for men of their size. He heard Delilah speaking to them in low tones, her voice taking on a rhythmic quality that suggested prayer or recitation rather than normal conversation. The brothers responded with sounds that were not quite words, utterances that had the cadence of speech, but lacked the clarity of language. Sleep would not come despite his exhaustion, and as the hours passed and the storm continued its assault on the mountains, Tolliver became aware of another sound beneath the wind. It was faint and intermittent, rising and falling in a way that might have been mistaken for the storm itself, except that it had a distinctly human quality. It sounded like women crying. Tolliver lay motionless in his bedroll, controlling his breathing and keeping his eyes nearly closed while he listened. The sound came again, muffled but unmistakable, the kind of crying that came from deep despair rather than immediate pain. It seemed to rise from beneath the floor, from somewhere under the cabin's foundation. When he mentioned it quietly to Delilah, asking if she heard the strange sounds the wind was making, she responded without hesitation that he was hearing angels. She explained in a flat, certain voice that the Lord sent angels to sing beneath their home, that it was a blessing granted to those who lived in righteousness and isolation from the corrupted world. Her answer was delivered with such conviction and such complete absence of deception that Tolliver understood he was dealing with genuine delusion rather than a lie meant to deflect suspicion. The brothers left before dawn as Delilah had promised, rising in the darkness and departing without words into the storm that still raged outside. Tolliver watched through slitted eyes as they moved through the cabin gathering items, their movements synchronized in a way that suggested they operated as a single entity divided into 3 bodies. After they left, Delilah began her morning routine, building up the fire and preparing a simple breakfast of cornmeal mush. She seemed to have forgotten Tolliver entirely, humming tunelessly to herself and occasionally speaking to the empty air as though in conversation with someone invisible. He realized that this might be his only opportunity to investigate the source of the crying, that once the brothers returned, he would have no chance to move freely and no hope of leaving the hollow alive if they discovered he suspected anything. While Delilah stood with her back turned tending the fire, Tolliver rose as quietly as possible and began examining the cabin floor. Near the far wall, partially concealed beneath a heavy trunk, he found what he was looking for. Several floorboards had been cut and fitted back into place so carefully that they were nearly invisible, but the gaps between them were slightly wider than the surrounding floor, and when he pressed down gently, he felt them shift. He waited until Delilah left the cabin to visit the outhouse, then moved the trunk aside and lifted the boards. Beneath them, a wooden ladder descended into darkness, and the smell that rose from below was unmistakable, the odor of human waste and unwashed bodies, and something else, something like fear given physical form. Tolliver descended into a cave system that extended back into the limestone beneath the cabin, a natural formation that the Ballards had expanded and modified into a prison. The darkness was absolute beyond the first few feet, but he had brought a candle stub from his pack, and by its flickering light he saw 3 women chained to iron rings driven into the rock walls. They cowered away from the light at first, whimpering and raising their hands as though expecting violence, and it took several minutes of quiet assurances before they understood he was not one of their captors. The women were emaciated and filthy, dressed in rags that had once been traveling clothes, their wrists and ankles bearing the raw wounds of prolonged restraint. The youngest appeared to be perhaps 19 years old, the oldest maybe 28. When they spoke, their voices were hoarse from disuse, and their stories emerged in fragments, but the essential facts were clear and horrifying. The woman who seemed most capable of coherent speech identified herself as Sarah Prewitt from Floyd County. She had been traveling to her sister's home in Virginia when 3 large men offered to show her a shorter path through the mountains. She had accepted their help because they seemed simple and harmless, speaking in childlike voices and avoiding eye contact in a way that suggested slowness of mind rather than predatory intent. They had led her away from the main trail and then suddenly changed, moving with coordinated precision to overpower and restrain her before she could even scream for help that would never have come in that isolated place. She had been in the cave for approximately 10 weeks, based on her attempt to track days by counting the times food was brought.